Welcome to the Faith and Feelings podcast. My name is Taylor Joy, and I'm passionate about helping you untangle and honor your emotions, authentically practice your faith, and integrate both into your everyday life so that you can experience the goodness and delight that comes from living in relationship with yourself, God, and others. Thank you for joining me. Let's get started. There's a phrase that has taken over a lot of our emotional vocabulary recently. I don't feel safe. It's a phrase that shows up in friendships, dating, therapy spaces, and even casual conversations. And in a lot of ways, it's become shorthand for something real, something important. There are absolutely relationships where people don't feel emotionally or physically safe, and I think that needs to be named clearly. But I also think there's another layer underneath it that's worth slowing down for today. I remember a few years ago, I heard author and psychiatrist Curt Thompson talk about this idea in a way that really stuck with me. He was pushing into how often we use the language of safety without always defining what we actually mean by it. And he was inviting us to consider something a little more nuanced. That we may actually be expanding the word safe to cover a much wider range of experiences than just danger. Because what can happen is that I don't feel safe starts to carry a lot of different meanings at once. Sometimes it becomes a way to exit discomfort quickly, or a way to avoid vulnerability rather than move towards it, or a kind of catch-all label that shuts down further exploration. And that distinction matters, especially when we're talking about friendship and emotional connection. Because what I think Curt is really getting at is not that people are wrong for feeling what they feel, but that we sometimes collapse a whole spectrum of emotional experiences into one category. And when we do that, we lose precision about what's actually happening inside of us. So let's slow down a little bit. When most people say, I don't feel safe, they could be naming a few different internal experiences. Sometimes it's real relational danger, manipulation, contempt, emotional volatility, unpredictability, or dismissal. But other times, what's actually happening is discomfort, or vulnerability, or exposure, or even just the unfamiliar feeling of being seen more deeply than we're used to. And these are not the same thing. Curt Thompson often reframes this by separating safe from comfortable. And this is what I really want to highlight, because in everyday language, we tend to merge those two together. We assume that if something is emotionally safe, it should always feel calm or easy or settled. But in his framework, and really in a lot of attachment and nervous system based work, that's not how safety actually functions. Safety is not the absence of activation. It's not the absence of anxiety or emotional intensity. Safety is what allows us to stay present even when those things are happening. So a more accurate way to think about it might be, safety is not I feel relaxed, but I don't feel alone in what I'm feeling. And that's a very different internal experience. You can be emotionally activated, nervous, exposed, even a little overwhelmed, and still be in a safe relationship. And conversely, you can be in a relationship that feels calm on the surface, but actually carries a lot of emotional constriction underneath it, where you don't feel free to be honest or fully seen. So when Curt pushes back on the overuse of I don't feel safe, he's not dismissing emotional experience. He's trying to refine it. He's asking, are we naming danger or are we naming discomfort? And if it's discomfort, then what kind? Because those distinctions matter for how we respond. If something is truly unsafe, if there's contempt, control, emotional coercion, or harm, then the appropriate response is protection, boundaries, distance, and sometimes even leaving the relationship. But if what's happening is vulnerability, if it's the feeling of being known more deeply than we're used to, or the discomfort of having our patterns reflected back to us, then the appropriate response is very different. That might actually be the edge of growth. Curt talks a lot about how the brain is shaped in relationship and how healing doesn't happen in isolation. It happens in contexts when we are known and still remain connected, where rupture can occur and repair is possible, where we are seen without being exiled. That's closer to what he would call safety, not ease and not comfort, but relational confidence, a sense that says, even if I don't have this perfectly together, even if I'm emotional or messy or unsure, I'm not going to lose connection here. I'm not going to be discarded for being human. And that kind of safety actually requires a certain amount of discomfort, because vulnerability always does. Which brings us back to friendship, because that is where this kind of language really matters. In friendships, and especially close ones, we often hit moments where something feels off. Someone says something that lands weird. There's misattunement, a silence that feels heavier than expected, a moment of misunderstanding. And internally, we might immediately label that as, this doesn't feel safe. But sometimes what we're actually experiencing is, I feel exposed right now. Or I don't know how this landed for them. Or I'm afraid of being misunderstood. Or I'm not used to this level of honesty. Those are very different internal states than actual danger. And if we can name them more precisely, it changes what we do next. Instead of shutting down or withdrawing under the assumption of unsafety, we might stay present long enough to say, something shifted there. Can we talk about it? Or, I felt a little exposed when I shared that, and I'm noticing I want to pull back. That kind of language keeps connection alive while still honoring internal experience. And I think this is where Curt's framing becomes really helpful, because he's not trying to minimize emotional signals. He's trying to help us interpret them more accurately. He's essentially inviting us to become more discerning about our internal alarm system. Not every activation is a warning sign of danger. Sometimes it's just the nervous system doing what it does when we step into intimacy, scanning for rejection, anticipating rupture, and remembering past experiences where vulnerability wasn't held well. And in those moments, the goal isn't to immediately exit the relationship or shut down the connection. The goal is to stay curious enough to ask, what am I actually responding to right now? That curiosity is where emotional maturity starts to form. Because if unsafe becomes our default label for discomfort, we lose the ability to stay in the very experiences that deepen connection. And ironically, we can start to make relationships feel less safe over time. Not because the other person is necessarily harmful, but because we've lost the capacity to stay present through the normal tensions that come with closeness. So maybe the invitation here isn't to stop using the language of safety, but to refine it. To ask, is this actually danger or is this exposure? Is this harm or is this vulnerability? Is this a relational pattern that's unsafe or is this a moment that feels emotionally intense? And underneath all of that, to remember Thompson's deeper point. Real emotional safety is not the absence of activation. It's the presence of connection inside activation. It's the experience of being able to stay with someone and stay with yourself when things are not perfectly comfortable. And in friendships, that might actually be one of the clearest markers of depth. Not that nothing ever feels awkward or tender or exposed, but that there is enough trust to stay present when it does. So, what does this actually look like in real life? Because all of this sounds really good in theory, this idea of emotional safety as relational confidence, but most of us don't experience relationships in abstract frameworks. We experience them in text messages, in awkward pauses, in misattuned conversations, and in moments when something lands weird and we don't quite know what to do with it. So if we're trying to move towards the kind of safety that Curt Thompson is describing, then what are we actually looking for in practice? And maybe the first thing to say is this. Emotional safety is less about a constant feeling and more about a repeated experience over time. It's not that you always feel calm with someone. It's that over time, your system learns something like, even when things get tense or unclear, I don't lose connection here. That learning happens through patterns, not perfection. So here are a few signs of that kind of safety in friendships and relationships. 1. Repair is possible after tension. This is a big one. Not whether conflict exists, but whether repair exists. In emotionally safe relationships, misunderstandings don't automatically turn into permanent distance. Something gets misread, something feels off, someone gets hurt, and instead of the relationship freezing or quietly fading, there's eventually a return. It doesn't have to be immediate. Sometimes there's space that's needed. Sometimes things feel tender for a while. But there's a sense that connection is still reachable. You can come back to it. You can say things like, hey, I've been thinking about what happened the other day, or I don't think I said what I meant very well, or even, can we revisit that? Something still feels unresolved for me. And the other person doesn't treat that as an inconvenience to avoid. They treat it as being part of a relationship. That's a form of safety that has nothing to do with avoiding conflict and everything to do with believing that connection can survive it. 2, you don't have to manage your emotional reality to stay connected. In some relationships, there's an unspoken pressure to stay easy, to stay agreeable, and to stay emotionally regulated in a very specific way in order to keep connection intact. But in emotionally safer relationships, there's more room for the actual texture of your internal world. You can say, I'm feeling off today, or I'm not totally sure what came up for me there, or I felt a little weird after that conversation, without immediately worrying that you've disrupted everything. And just as importantly, you're not punished, either explicitly or subtly, for having an emotional experience. There isn't a sense that your feelings are too much for the relationship to hold. 3, discomfort doesn't automatically equal rejection. This is one of the biggest nervous system shifts that can happen in safe connection. In less secure relational patterns, any discomfort can quickly get interpreted as danger. A delayed text becomes, they're pulling away. A slightly flat tone becomes, something is wrong. A moment of misattunement becomes, I've ruined this. But in more emotionally safe relationships, there's a growing capacity to hold discomfort without immediately assigning it meaning about abandonment or rejection. You might still feel activated. You might still wonder. But there's a little more space inside of you to pause and say, I don't actually know what this means yet. That pause is not passive. It's actually a form of regulation that comes from experience, not just insight. 4, there is room for difference without collapse. This one is especially important in close friendships because closeness doesn't mean sameness. In emotionally unsafe dynamics, difference can feel threatening. If you disagree, if you see something differently, if you have a different emotional response, it can feel like disconnection is imminent. But in emotionally safer relationships, difference doesn't automatically become rupture. You can hold different perspectives, different emotional rhythms, and even different levels of investment at times without the relationship needing to be resolved into sameness or intensity or distance. There's a kind of steadiness that says we don't have to match in order to stay connected. 5, your nervous system has moments of settling in their presence. This one is subtle and it's not always consistent, but it's noticeable over time. It's not that you never feel anxious or activated around this person. It's that your system begins to recognize patterns of reliability. You might notice that you exhale more easily when you're with them, or that you don't feel like you have to constantly monitor how you're being perceived, or that there's less internal bracing for criticism or withdrawal. And again, it's not perfection, it's pattern recognition. Your body starts to learn, I don't have to stay on high alert here. And 6, you can tell the truth in small increments. This is a really important relational marker that often gets overlooked. Emotional safety isn't just about being able to say the biggest, deepest, and most vulnerable things all at once. Sometimes it's about being able to be honest in layers. You don't have to fully decode your emotional experience before you're allowed to speak it. You can say things like, I'm not totally sure what came up, but something did. Or, I think I felt a little off, but I'm still trying to figure out why. Or, I want to be honest about something, even though I don't have full clarity on it yet. And instead of being met with impatience or pressure to clarify immediately, it's met with space. And that space matters because it allows your emotional life to unfold in real time, rather than forcing it into premature certainty just to preserve connection. And when you put all of this together, what starts to emerge is a very different picture of emotional safety than the one we often inherit in conversation. It's not a state of constant calm. It's not the absence of tension. It's not even the absence of emotional activation. It's the repeated experience of staying connected through complexity. It's the ability to have moments of misattunement without losing the relationship. It's the sense, slowly built over time, that says, even when this is hard or unclear or a little uncomfortable, I'm still in relationship here. And that, in a very real way, might be closer to what Curt Thompson is pointing towards when he talks about safety, not comfort and not ease, but the kind of relational comfortability and confidence that allows us to stay present and connected both with ourselves and with other people when things are not perfectly settled. I'm so grateful that you listened to today's episode. Thank you for spending time with me. I'd love to hear from you. Connect with me on Instagram at TaylorJoy or through my website, taylorjoymurray.co. Also, if you enjoyed this conversation, it would mean so much to me if you took a minute to subscribe and review the podcast. This is an easy way to partner with me and is invaluable in reaching new listeners. Until next week.